This week on Just Solutions, we look ahead to Earth Day. It was first celebrated in 1970. Now, 51 years later, what's happening with the Earth Day network? How are they mobilising global action to address the increasing threats to the environment, a warming planet and the climate crisis? Today, Kathleen Rogers, president of the Earth Day network, joins us to talk about strategies that we can adopt nationally and globally to make a difference, not just on Earth Day, but year-round. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Kathleen, it's good to have you with us. 51 years after the first Earth Day was celebrated, where are we now? But before we dig into that, take us back to 1970. What was the impetus behind the Earth Day celebration and what came out of that?
So imagine sort of a little bit of Charles Dickens in a way, 150 years of industrial pollution beginning in the late 1800s. And now it's 1969. Our rivers are on fire in the US. We have toxic exposure for children. We have our bald eagle on what would soon become the endangered species list from DDT and a host of other issues. You couldn't see across the street in Los Angeles, apparently, during rush hour. It was so polluted with smog. So we had a youngish senator from the center of the US, Gaylord Nelson, who wanted to create an environmental teach-in to take advantage of the social unrest and commitment of young people around civil rights and the Vietnam War and a bunch of other issues that were inspiring youth to take action at the time. So capitalizing on that, he came up with a great idea to do a teach-in. Then he hired a young, amazing guy named Dennis Hayes. And Dennis and he turned it from an environmental teach-in on campus to a national event that brought 20 million people out into the streets, which remains the largest civic event in human history. Nothing has ever come close to 20 million people in a single country, which represented about 11% of our population. Largely peaceful in every city, small town, park across the country. And it scared the heck out of Richard Nixon, who was a little paranoid to begin with, and most of the Congress, which then responded in a really powerful way to the popularity overnight, I think, of environmentalism. And after that first Earth Day, the US legislature, and Richard Nixon signed them all, created this huge list of environmental rules and regulations, but particularly laws, our major laws from the Endangered Species Act, Toxic Control Act, our Pesticides Act. I mean, the list goes on of laws that passed in quick succession, taking advantage of what happened on that first Earth Day and also responding to this massive outcry about where things were. But even beyond Earth Day, the same organizers, Dennis Hayes in particular, created something called the Dirty Dozen. So Earth Day was in April 1970 and elections were later that year. And they identified 12 members of Congress, called the Dirty Dozen, that they were going after. Those people in particular were anti-environmental in their view, and they defeated most of them. So that combination of 20 million people on the streets and this super election result created this wave, this honeymoon for environmental regulation in the United States. And so for 10 years, that ripple effect of Earth Day was extraordinary. It also led to the creation of most of the big environmental groups, many of which celebrate their 50th anniversary in the years following that first Earth Day. So it was a combination of factors of a great, huge percentage of our population, the wake-up call for Congress and Richard Nixon. And by the way, he signed and celebrated many of the laws that Congress passed. So he had a good environmental record. And then that sort of era of honeymoon where I think corporations and others weren't quite prepared to fight back the way they were in subsequent decades. Now, and I think we'd say generally over the last couple of decades, we've been in a standoff around climate change and other environmental issues. That all changed, of course, in November, and we're in a different place altogether.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But in addition to the undeniable environmental degradation that was going on 52 years ago in 1969, you mentioned the rivers on fire, the smog, the air quality, it was undeniable. But there was also the recognition that the climate was warming even back then. And yet that didn't get as much attention or action, it seemed, as some of those other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. There were scientists and others talking about the warming effect. They didn't have quite the language that we have today, which is, of course, much more scientifically based and understandable to the general public. Nonetheless, people were talking about this concept of the world warming. And as we now know, some of our major oil companies in the United States knew it as well, but kept the lid on all of their own research. They knew it even before 1970. But people were starting to understand that burning fossil fuels was creating this envelope around the planet, which inevitably would lead to warming and changes in weather patterns and a number of other destructive forces. So while they didn't have the vocabulary exactly or the scientific proof the way they had even a decade later, they were still talking about it in 1970.
Well, you mentioned that honeymoon period, that decade that came out of the first Earth Day, where we saw an awful lot of environmental regulations passed, environmental education becoming normalized in schools. And you said that maybe corporations weren't prepared to push back. They certainly got their act together in terms of pushing back on environmental regulations. What happened then from the 1980s, take us up until where we are today, in terms of some of that pushback against environmental regulations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting history where, and you can use the analogy, interestingly, of seatbelts. This may seem off topic, but it's not. And I've looked at a lot of these things. It's very interesting. The automobile industry, when they started passing regulations around seatbelts, fought them, spent hundreds of millions of $2021 fighting seatbelts and other kinds of regulation. Now they celebrate safety. It's the same thing in the environmental movement, where industry starting to feel that it might impact their bottom line or they might not make the same profits, didn't look at it the way we look at it now, as a profit zone, as a way to capitalize on the tragedy of climate change so everybody can make money as we fix the problem. So we went through this evolution where we passed lots of environmental laws. The industry suddenly felt that their bottom line was threatened and outspent us 10 to 1 or 100 to 1, depending on the campaign, and used all sorts of nefarious and complicated community infiltration methods. We have hundreds of stories like this to make sure that they drag their feet, maintain the status quo. It's the same with the electric car, same with energy regulation of the coal industry. Whatever it is, industry suddenly became very smart and using different tactics over that decade after Earth Day. And so we've seen this incredibly difficult round and round process with industry each time we try to get something done. Inevitably, the industry celebrates it, but it's in their best interest to drag it out as long as they can so they can get prepared for it, come up with new technologies. Instead of really being part of the solution, they've always been part of the problem.
Well, Earth Day 2021 is going to look a lot different than Earth Day 2020. There is a new administration, but we've had 4 years of not just inaction on the environment and climate change, but active regression when it comes to rolling back environmental regulations, as well as the increase in support of the fossil fuel industry. So what are your thoughts as we head into Earth Day 2021? About the urgency of what lies ahead and what is being done right now under a Biden administration to tackle it?
Yeah, it's very complicated. Our 50th anniversary last year was, of course, overwhelmed by COVID. And this year it is largely virtual, although there's a ton of stuff happening on the ground worldwide, depending on the country and the restrictions. That is an interesting topic because I think more than anything, it really demonstrated the connection between nature and human action. And so there's so many commonalities between fighting COVID, resilience, sharing resources, data, and fighting the climate crisis and other environmental issues. And that's one big thing that's happened over the years since COVID-19 that's separate from what Donald Trump did to us, both in terms of our global reputation and setting back the movement by at least 4 years. what I've seen with President Biden, and we're really grateful for it, is that he not only made it part of his campaign, but on day one, he rejoined the Paris Agreement. He asked all of the regulators to take a look at the things that Donald Trump did last minute and roll them back if they possibly could. He's created real certainty in the marketplace by saying the United States is going to lead climate change, which is exactly what business wants to know. In fact, most of the automobile industry had joined a U.S. government lawsuit against the state of California, which had upped their miles per gallon requirements for new cars sold in California. The day after Biden was elected, many of those automobile companies dropped out of that litigation, which should have been viewed as really embarrassing for them. But instead, the automobile industry's come back and said, okay, we can get the job done. We're going to move to EVs. I think Biden did things like appoint an astonishingly progressive, smart group of people to run all of their agencies. He also declared climate change to be something that crossed all agencies. So whether it's the Education Department or National Security Council or the Pentagon or any of the Department of Defense, he has integrated climate change across all levels and sectors of the U.S. government, which in turn spurs other state and local governments to do the same thing. And by the way, those state and local governments had been working really hard, despite what Donald Trump had done, both to our reputation and to our domestic energy production by setting it back. But we are really on the bandwagon in terms of thanking those cities and state governments for all the work they did in those 4 years. President Biden also did things that were partly symbolic and partly critically important to the almost generation of people who've been fighting pipelines by putting a stop to or a pause to the Keystone pipeline and to looking really hard at how we produce and regulate our oil and gas industry. These were all things that were in the process or had actually finished completion through those 4 years. So those 4 years in climate terms of us being out of the Paris Agreement, of rolling back regulations, of siding with industry in some of the most, I have to admit, insane regulations, such as dumping in our nation's streams and our waters, things that would kill local fish populations, undermine local economies. All of those things that transpired are now either in the process of being rolled back or they've stopped altogether. And there are a few things maybe we won't get done overnight, but we're hoping in the next couple of years we can really undo the damage that Donald Trump did to the world.
Are there any areas that you're concerned that you're not seeing enough action from the Biden administration on? I mean, you've outlined so many of the positive things that we've seen, but there is so much damage that needs to be repaired. I mean, say plastics, for instance. Plastics is a huge issue, and we'll talk about that more in a minute because that's a big focus of the Earth Day network. Are we seeing Biden coming out with legislation or policies or even, declaring that this is a problem that's going to be tackled as well?
Well, I think there are a couple of areas in addition. So let's talk about plastics for a second. Earth Day's theme for a couple of years ago was on plastics. And we saw this extraordinary rise as a result of everybody becoming energized around that whole Earth Day period, which used to be a day and then a week and then a month. And it's now Earth season. And so we were able to generate, along with lots of other people, but particularly our focus on plastics drove that conversation in a way that I think we mounted a ton of really interesting campaigns at the state level, the global level. People are talking about a plastics treaty. We can't underestimate the oil industry's interest in promoting plastics, nor in companies, Coke, Pepsi, Unilever, the big ones, who say the right thing, but are focused on recycling instead of getting rid of a product that we know is undermining our physical health, our hormones, our child's growth. Plastic is everywhere. We eat the equivalent of a plastic credit card, I think, once a week. It is everywhere in our bodies, from the top to the bottom of the earth, in our fish, our breast milk, whatever it is, it's all over the place. And we need to destroy it, get rid of that product, which, by the way, is incredibly useful. So what we want to do is find those industries, in particular, plastic bottles and that sort of industry, where the disposal of which is impossible. Recycling in most countries is not profitable. There's no market for it. It works in a couple places, but overall promoting recycling, either by the oil industry or by the big polluter side, the big Coke, Pepsis of the world, has got to stop, because it's not the solution to the problem. The solution is finding a different product. Now, we know plastics are incredibly important for the medical industry and other industries, and there is no substitute right now. But the major polluters are not those industries. It's personal consumer use, and we need to end that right now. I think another area, so we're not seeing those signals coming out of the Biden administration yet, but it's only been less than 100 days. So we're hoping that we'll see some real progress on that, both nationally and globally, where everybody now is in agreement that it's a real health risk. There are a couple of biodiversity issues that I've worked on. As you know, Donald Trump rolled back protection for the gray wolf, and many of our states have gone on this rampage of slaughtering every wolf in the United States. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. It doesn't have to happen. We're not seeing the Biden administration on some Endangered Species Act acting quickly enough, in my view, but we'll see. I think also, again, a major issue for Earth Day and for hundreds of millions of people, teachers, school administrators, universities, the need to build a climate literate and civically skilled electorate is reaching critical importance. Because if you don't educate kids, and this can happen quickly, it doesn't take a generation, but from 1970 till now, and we've done a World Bank study on this issue, we know that climate literacy is not anywhere where it should be. And there's not a country in the world that properly teaches it or prepares their citizens, not just to understand climate, the science of climate, to believe in climate. Both things are really important, but for the jobs, there's no reason in green energy, in transforming the world to green products, because we have to reimagine everything from the chair I'm sitting on to this computer to everything, to get rid of plastics, to use renewable energy. From solar panels, those do not have to be owned the way the tech industry is owned by about half a dozen companies. Energy is distributed. Every country makes its own energy. Every country can manufacture its new buildings, its new roads, its new bridges using materials. They don't have to depend on China or the US or the EU to provide those services. So if we want an equitable green economy, different than the tech industry, we need to start educating our kids so they can become the entrepreneurs and leaders of tomorrow. So that is a critical issue for Earth Day, is climate literacy, civic skill building, and of course, retraining our existing job workers and people entering into the job market on these new jobs, because the ones of the Dickinson days are about to phase out. And we want to prepare not just US unions, which are critically important, but also workers around the world, so that we don't have a handful of people owning the green economy. We can't let that happen to poor countries. We can't let it happen in the United States.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about what climate literacy could look like, and certainly that education. There is a certain amount of environmental education happening in schools. Of course, on Earth Day, we're going to see kids drawing pictures of trees, maybe even planting a tree, and corporations, many of the ones that you've already mentioned, also coming out with their own statements, possibly focusing on recycling, which, as you said, is just almost a distraction to the real problem. It's almost greenwashing what's going on. But in terms of climate education, it does seem that certainly for young kids in schools in America, there's a lot of focus on recycling, on that issue. You know, you could ask a kindergartner, which tub does this particular project go into, and they know how to separate everything. But that seems to be where that education stops when it comes to the environment. To your mind, what would real climate literacy and climate-focused environmental education look like in schools, from the youngest kid all the way up through third level?
Okay, now I'm talking both about the United States and worldwide. We did a big study on where the world is on climate education. And frankly, everybody got an F. I'm sorry, they did. And the reason they did is because in the United States, for example, and this is a new study that just came out, children in high school, so 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grades, receive less than 1 hour a year on climate change and other environmental issues. If you can imagine, we live on a planet, we're surrounded by critically important things, from biodiversity to trees, to how we get to and from to work. Whatever the issue is, environment, the definition of environment is what surrounds you. So it's also an environmental justice issue. If what surrounds you is awful, then your environment is bad, generally speaking. And so both from an equity point of view, from an entrepreneurial point of view, we need to begin to educate kids from kindergarten through senior year in high school, using every subject, math, science, art, history, teaching them the language of entrepreneurism, teaching the language of civic participation, teaching them the language of climate and environmentalism in every subject they learn. Why? What's good for the planet. But if you want to be profitable, if you want the country to stay on top, if you want us to progress down the green road, you absolutely need educated people for 3 reasons. You want them to be climate literate. You want them to have the civic skills to fight back against companies and local governments that recognize the powerlessness of our vulnerable and poor communities. You want kids to be able to think down the line about where they're going to make their money, how they can participate in this. And you want to build a green consumer movement so that everything we build and create that's green, there's a market there to buy it, because that will drive the industry to continually improving their environmental record. So there are lots of reasons to have a climate literate and civic skilled, trained population, and it won't take us a generation to do it. We can do it and begin to do it right in a few years. It is not going to be cheap. It means you've got to rewrite the curricula. You've got to train the teachers. You've got to convince states that are climate deniers, and they're more than a handful, to actually request money from the federal government to do all of these things. So it's a complicated effort that requires buy-in from everybody. But the real long-term reason is to build a sustainable economy, to be equitable and just, to give those communities the civic skill building education that they need to fight back, because we know climate change will be very local. Some communities will do well, others will do terribly. And for the most part, there are poor communities, not just in the United States, but worldwide.
Well, taking it back to the original Earth Day in 1970, you said very much that was built on the energy of the youth activism that we saw happening around, peace protests and civil rights. There's a huge amount of youth energy happening right now around the climate, between the school strikes and the walkouts, and young people really demanding change and saying, your generation, the older generations, have completely let us down, and we're the ones who are going to have to fix this. How do we tap into that and harness that youth energy in the absence of a real climate literacy program right now in schools? How do we harness that youth energy that's already out there?
Well, it's a complicated issue. And so, there have been some terrific spokespersons, Greta Thunberg, Alexandria Villasenor, could name dozens of people who've sort of put their life and time for this subject. I've also seen it become cyclical. So 15 years ago, there were tons of kids protesting climate change, but they age out. They go on to live their lives. They go to college, and we'll see that happening with this movement too. The other thing that I'm cautious about is I've seen big international institutions, when youth movements had asked for a seat at the table, there's a lot of tokenism going on that I think the youth really know about. I think the most important thing is that we constantly encourage youth groups, because they don't want to hear from me, to constantly recruit and prepare leaders as they age out, to bring on new leaders and to really continually educate and train, literally every couple of years, a new set of leaders. Because when you're 15 or 16, you have a different energy and a different focus. And as you become 18, headed off to college or to work or whatever it is, your time changes, your ability to sustain the movement changes. And the younger people coming up don't want to hear from you. So it requires constant retraining of kids at the youngest levels, which then ties back to climate education and civic skill building. Because if you teach kids that they're powerful, they'll act powerfully. I've seen it over and over again. We run programs in schools where the kids will get up, they learn some basic civic skills, and they'll go into a city council meeting or a school board meeting and demand change. And inevitably, they're successful. But what happens is they age out. So we need to bring more and more kids into the movement and allow the kids to train their own successors in action. So we're seeing a little bit of that now, where some of the great leaders from even 2 years ago are now training younger children to come up through the movement. We have kids as young as 13 who are powerful voices, but we also don't want to see them co-opted by governments, by international agencies who realize that they can tame the power of youth by giving them a seat at the table, sort of. And I've seen this over and over again. So while we are really enthusiastic about everything that youth have been able to accomplish, we also recognize they need to keep the movement going by passing the baton.
Well, we'd love to hear where our viewers are tuning in from. Kristen left us a note on Facebook saying the Green New Deal is a farce. Kristen says there's no such thing as clean energy. She says we need to talk about overpopulation and over extraction, which is the actual issue, because you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. So often that idea of growth is tied to progress, and the two terms are often used interchangeably. I mean, as you were saying earlier, it's impacting every single sector of our society. So it seems like we need an absolutely brand new paradigm when we think equating progress with growth, given, as Kristen pointed out, the finite nature of our resources.
She is absolutely 1000% correct. Nobody, in particular the environmental community, and I've been in this position before, nobody has the guts to talk about population. And what are we headed to? 10 billion? I mean, it's just not slowing. And it's certainly not slowing in countries that are the most susceptible to climate change. And so you have this crazy system where you're going to see massive increases in population, and you're also constantly focused on growth, growth, growth. Now, stepping back, you can't get anybody to talk about slowing growth, because as far as economists are concerned, that's the beginning of the end. Fundamental change takes a crisis. But even with the climate crisis, we're all talking about building a new sustainable green economy, but nobody has any idea what that means. And no one will talk about the two subjects which she just raised, which is slowing growth and changing the paradigm entirely, and then slowing population, because both of those things are an anathema to country leaders, some of which view it as, the North trying to control the South. And some people view it as a way to slow or stop growth, which for the developing world and for lesser developed countries is not what they want to hear either. So I agree completely. I often wonder whether it's the next challenge or whether I'm kidding myself that I can't do either. But she's absolutely right that if we could take both those bulls by the horn, it would fundamentally change the outcome for the planet.
Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, Kathleen. I know the theme for Earth Day Network's Earth Day Celebration 2021 is Restore the Earth. In the minute that we have left, how do we even begin to do that?
Well, there are a couple things. One is climate change. It's had sort of a chair with two legs, or a stool with two legs. It's had mitigation. How do we mitigate the damage? And how do we adapt to it? So mitigation and adaptation. Restore our Earth is a completely different concept. It's about using the world's natural systems, which people like Tom Lovejoy and other really amazing biologists and chemists agree that that is critically important way to solve the climate change crisis. Because if you stop burning fossil fuels today, you'd still have 150, 200 years of carbon in the atmosphere. That has to be removed. We have to use natural systems to do that. The other part of that third leg to the stool is technology. There are safe, interesting, been around for a long time, fully vetted technologies that we think we can use to remove some of that carbon from the atmosphere, figure out ways that we can restore our oceans, use our natural systems to do that, whether it's reforestation, regenerative agriculture, and other issues that will give back the power of the land, the soil, the oceans to absorb some of that carbon. So ours is much more hopeful, in my view, much more practical than either adaptation or mitigation. And everyone will have a fit that I said that, but it's true.
Well, there's a lot of information about this year's Earth Day events and all of the topics that we've touched on today with Kathleen Rogers at the website earthday.org. Kathleen, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, join us next week, same time, same place, for Just Solutions, as we continue our look at environmental issues with a look at rights of nature. This is a growing movement that recognizes that nature itself has legal rights. How's that manifesting itself in communities here in the US? Tune in, same time, same place next week for Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.